Hi, so we're continuing. As I said, it's 4:30. I left you at about 2:45. I wanted to finish, so I finished the PowerPoint and we'll adopt a bit of a flipped classroom for tonight because you've got a presentation. I want to make sure you've got enough time to go through the material. So I'm going to run that through tonight, and then hopefully you have time to listen to the video, and then we will address some of these things on Wednesday again. But I know I'm conscious of the fact that by Wednesday it'll be a day before your presentation. So in the interest of giving you the best possible circumstances to carry out your assignment, I'm going to just cover what I would have hoped to cover. I'm not sad that we didn't, because I do want to make the most of these discussions which we're having in class, which are great, but it's just that we're very short of instruction time. So here we come with the flipped classroom. So some of the challenges, you had come up with a list that we put on the board, and hopefully it's still there, but I wanted to also offer you my take on some of the challenges. So in terms of constructivism, allowing teachers enough freedom to avoid micromanagement, you had that on the board, you came up with that, so there's no problem there. Developing a growth mindset in your staff, you came up with that as well, so no surprise there. Empowering teachers to not fear change and free choice. So that's something important too. Free choice, we mentioned the fact that there's a relinquishing of power. You had both of these together on the board, respecting student choice, and then being for teachers to be comfortable relinquishing some of the power of the power. So that's a challenge for teachers, and it's going to be a challenge for. I'm just looking at my. A challenge for leaders as well, to create these conditions. In terms of social constructivism, leading on from what we have on the board, encouraging teachers to break out of silo individual perspective, so working collaboratively, creating communities of practice. That's going to be a challenge. How, as a leader, do you do that? Modeling that interpersonal relations do not trump objectives. By this, I mean that obviously we all work within a context where there are imperatives and variables that are external, but showing that we take time to discuss things together, work things collaboratively, and that we're not just objective focused, but we are interpersonal, so relationship focused too. And the third challenge, making staff feel comfortable with virtual networking for PD. And we discussed this lunchtime, so you understand how that makes sense. Because obviously, you can create most of the supports for faculty, for staff within your organization, but that's not going to be sufficient. They have to be able to tap into a wider body of a sort of collective body of practices and networks. So that doesn't just happen. You have to create an environment where teachers feel comfortable to do that. Experiential learning, some challenge there. Go beyond the liability lens on schools. We've talked about this when we talked about the outdoors, so this is not a new argument, and you can see how often the risk and the dollar sign that goes with the risk management is something that stops us from trying some of these experiential learning opportunities. Allowing teachers freedom and avoid micromanagement. We've had this before in constructivism, but it happens in terms of experiential learning as well. And pushing staff beyond their perception of play as escapism. So this is really important too, because I think we all have been it's been ingrained in us almost that as soon as kids have fun, we're not attaining objectives. And it's really hard to get teachers to value that again and to go beyond that and to actually see that in fun and in exploration, experiential learning, there's fun, but there's also genuine learning happening there. So I think it was successful. We covered most of these in the presentation. So it's a good wrap up. So I want to give you a few reads. This article is far too old, almost 20 years old, but I do love it, and I've not come across anything else that does that. It's a text from Hong Kong, but it talks about the notion of constructivist leadership to achieve constructivist teaching. And there's no such thing as constructivist leadership, but it's an interesting parable that the author is doing and saying, really, we have to mirror something which is very similar to what we're trying to do with the kids within constructivism if we are to encourage teachers to actually try constructivism as well. So constructivist leadership doesn't exist, but you're going to have to think in groups what comes closest to it. What in all the leadership styles that are in that slide that I've showed you and that comes last in this PowerPoint, and also the recognized leadership styles, the main recognized leadership styles. Which ones are the ones that come as close as possible to this notion of constructivist leadership, which is interesting in itself. And then you've got a couple of standard sort of writings. They're implementing change in instructional delivery of classroom, so phenomenological approach, looking at how teachers feel when they are trying to implement change in instruction and delivery. Another one, Orlando ICT, Constructivist Teaching, 21st Century Learning. I put those two because they're open access and you can have a look if that helps you. But it does challenge leaders to create perfect conditions for constructivist culture to be created within school. And it's the fact that it's difficult is evidenced by the fact that we've been at it for 100 years and we're not super successful at it in the majority of schools. The other thing I want you to have a look at is Pasi Sahlberg. So he's a Finnish writer. So you've seen probably the video clip of the film Where to Invade Next. And a lot of it is tongue-in-cheek. Sometimes we're a bit wary of these videos, and I think we have to sometimes be a bit wary about what's written about Finland. But certainly a big part of reform in Finland is due to Pasi Sahlberg's writing. He's been very famous. He's very sort of well respected in the world. So have a look at his website and also have a look at his publications. He's got an affiliation with the University of New South Wales in Australia, and you've got a list of his publications. If you manage to, through the library, to get a few Pasi Sahlberg writings, you will see that there's a lot of pragmatism, a lot of realism with regards to the variables that we are working with in terms of standardized testing, neoliberalism, all of these things. But he also is a strong advocate of constructivism, and he pushes for reform in educational settings so that we reach constructivism despite all the pressures that push us against it. Okay, so there's been covered in class. Now there's some other things that I didn't have time to cover in class. We didn't talk about critical pedagogy in the film, and that's maybe one criticism that can be made about Most Likely to Succeed, is that it doesn't touch on critical pedagogy, although it is seen as a pressing priority within 21st century learning. Why does it not, and where do you see that it doesn't? It doesn't really look at gender sort of inequality. It doesn't look at sexual orientation. It doesn't look at race. It touches slightly on socioeconomics in the sense that it says that half the kids come from a lottery. That's due to the fact that it's a charter school and it really has to do that. But if it wants subsidy from the government, partial subsidy, but it doesn't really go into changing the dynamics of socioeconomic sort of power inequities or race or things like this. But that is also a challenge we've identified for the 21st century teacher, and therefore it's going to be a challenge for the 21st century leader. And in the next slide, I'm going to see what some of the challenges that are raised in terms of leadership. And then I would add a fifth that we didn't have originally, but I think it is also a challenge in 21st century education, is inclusion. And that's not covered by the other four, but it is pressing and it is part of the legislative framework. And despite the fact that we've had a legislative framework to make inclusion a reality for now almost 15 years, 20 in some states and provinces, a little less in others, why is genuine inclusion still such a challenge? We have a lot of pushback. So now you can see the difficulties that you probably experience again as teachers, and you may want to talk about that in your reflection 2A. But in your reflection 2B, you are also going to have to think about this in terms of leadership, and as a leader, what are some of the challenges and solutions that you envisage around these two objectives? Now, there may be other current challenges. I would say those are the big ones. Those are the theoretical ones, and I would say that if you go through literature, you're going to keep hitting this five. But there are others, and so if some of you have seen the principle, that's why I found it useful with other students in other cohorts, because it is entertaining, it's sort of a bit of a thriller, but it does raise some very genuine operational challenges. So these would not be theoretical, but it would be more at a level of operations at the moment. So maybe have a look at the principle if you have time before Thursday. Otherwise, brainstorm and think of what are some of the other operational challenges that are experienced by leaders, and then try and see what kind of leadership styles we have to advocate to address these. So leadership challenges that I've exposed for you. We didn't have time to do this in class. I'm doing it now. So critical pedagogy, as you remember, it's all about challenging the status quo and rectifying power inequitable power dynamics within schools. So it's fairly radical. It's challenging, often thinks outside the box, and it doesn't really allow any sort of protection for the teacher or for the leader, in a sense that it does really ask for a sort of revision of the status quo and a change of power dynamics. So it can be really challenging, both for teachers and for leaders. For leaders, maintaining a supervisory role while staff gets subversive. So I've used the word subversive on purpose because it's used quite often in critical pedagogy literature, because obviously teachers who work within a critical pedagogy framework will not be afraid to talk about politics, talk about race, talk about some of these difficult topics and topics that relate back to minority status. So they are inherently subversive in their language and their discourse and the things they put forward. So how does a supervisor, how does a principal deal with that? It's one of the challenges. Examining one's relationship with power. So as a leader too, you have to examine your relationship with power. If you're invested in the status quo yourself, you're going to be very challenged by critical pedagogy. So how can one do both? How can one sort of assume the role of leader and yet also remain open to their authority being challenged within an organization in the spirit of growth mindset again? Exploring one's position towards the institutional agenda. So obviously, critical pedagogy is going to ask that everyone really reflects hard and reaches a different level of consciousness. So for the learner, it's understanding that they may be oppressed or marginalized and finding a voice and doing something about it. For the teacher, it's moving out of the banking model and the traditional way of teaching and accepting their role as almost provocateurs, as sort of disruptors, so that students reach this level of consciousness. And for leaders, it's going to be also, sort of challenging their position within hierarchical power and structure, so that they are open to change, even if it sort of threatens some of their vested interest. Leading change from within, being a disruptor. That's what's asked of leaders within critical pedagogy. Obviously, saying, we're not going to fight the institution from the outside, we're fighting it from the inside. Again, with a view to being disruptors in a good sense, disruptive for positive change towards social justice within an institution. But that's not easy, right? It's not easy being an insider and being a disruptor at the same time. And that's what leaders often have an issue with critical pedagogy. And then dealing with external pressures and protecting your staff from these pressures, because obviously, as we've started to discuss, we sometimes have pressure from the ministry, from some of our colleagues overseas, or from school boards, or from accreditation offices. And sometimes it's about maintaining the culture within and protecting your staff from these variables that we have to deal with, but we don't necessarily have to compromise to. So now for the last sort of current 2019 sort of educational challenge for leaders, it's inclusion. So some of the things that are difficult, I'm going to switch myself up there. Does that move? Yes, it moves. Okay, so I can read the slide. Operating an institutional shift from medical model to social model perspective. So we've discussed this already. We discussed during the pre-residency. So you've had a couple of videos and you understand this. Medical model also seen as a deficit model. The problem is the child. The child has a label. That label is a disability or a deficit. Whereas if you want to be generally inclusive, you have to move to a social model perspective where you accept that actually disability is an interaction between, or lack of fit again, between the embodiment of the child and the way we are designing instruction, or the way we're designing exams and assessment, or even the way we're designing buildings. So our role becomes, instead of creating retrofitting, creating specific interventions for a specific child and a specific label, it becomes to revisit a model of delivery of assignment or assessment or of building to remove potential barriers. So we put our designer hat on and we rethink with flexibility the way we are offering instruction to students. So that's very difficult because a deficit model and medical model has been ingrained in us for over a century, and it's a shift that leaders are going to find very difficult. Encouraging a growth mindset, you've seen this keeps coming back in most of our categories of challenges, and supporting staff as they adopt a design perspective. So this design perspective is really hard. I talk from experience. I'm a consultant in universal design. That's why I do a lot. I go into school boards and schools and I work with them on this. It's not a hat. I've just talked about having a hat as a designer. It's not a hat we've been trained to have. It's one that we see as being onerous and a bit daunting. And so it's one that we don't necessarily want to take on. We'd rather do what we're told rather than take the initiative and redesign our instruction or redesign our assessment. So you're trying to shift them towards things like universal design for learning, backwards design. There's several sort of frameworks that are operating this shift from a medical model or deficit model to social model, but all of them are going to create a lot of friction because staff are really usually resistant to try. So that's going to be the leader's challenge. It's going to be creating a change of culture and mindset. And lastly, navigating conflicting external variables. So just as we've seen above, in critical pedagogy, we're protecting staff from external variables that were conflicting with what we're trying to do internally. Same thing with here. We have conflicting external values. So we're trying to do certain things that are social model based within the school, but then we keep being reminded by the outside world that the outside world is pressing these other variables onto the work that we're doing, particularly when it comes to funding, for example, because the funding in school is still deficit model based, or medical model based, with coding for certain disability. So an inherent contradiction there. It gets very difficult to do things internally in one way and then to have the outside world talk to you along the lines of another model. So this is heavy, right? We've seen 5 different models, or theoretical models that sort of encourage change, but then we've seen a whole list for each of challenges that leaderships are faced with. Now we have an added complexity. I'm going to put myself back down. We have an added complexity, and that's this notion of neoliberal landscape. So I've explained, but I thought I'd explain it again, and then we would keep that in mind as we do this reflection on leadership. And I hope that on Thursday you can take this on board too and find a way of incorporating this into your reflection and your presentation. So regardless of what you're trying to do on any of these 5 dimensions of change, positive change that we've seen, you are now stuck in this neoliberal landscape. So what is neoliberalism again? So in case you missed it when I explained last week, it's a theory that comes from economics, and that really argues that the markets should be free and that the best possible result for the majority of people is reached when the markets are free. It's a reaction really to sort of communism and sort of planned economies such as Soviet economy and things like this. So you want to liberate and deregulate markets because when they're very free, they reach the best potential results. Now, people who are victim of neoliberalism may argue against that, right? The little shopkeeper who goes out of business because Walmart moves next to them might say, I don't see the benefit of neoliberalism, but neoliberalism is going to take a very big picture perspective and say, well, if the little corner shop has disappeared, it's because it wasn't competitive, it was charging too much, it wasn't customer sort of focused enough, and therefore it was really the best thing that could happen for the majority of customers. So it's been around for obviously a long time. It's not things that you are unfamiliar with in terms of economics and markets. But it appeared in education. When did it appear? So again, a sharp turn there because of 2 leaders. Well, at the same time as Thatcher was present in the UK, Reagan was present in the US, and they both had a very similar discourse. They had a similar discourse about lots of things, Russia, end of Cold War, lots of things, but they had a similar discourse on these on this. And they wanted to bring education into the market arena. And then by doing that, say that neoliberalism applied to schools as well, and that schools were not protected from that. And therefore that the best possible results for all clients, parents, would be reached by freeing the markets. How does it affect schools, public and private? Because often I have students say, I work in the public sector, I'm not affected by that. But that's not true, right? Obviously, it affects the private sector, it always has, because in the way they've always been sort of treated as business enterprise, therefore subject to market forces. But what was really pivotal in Thatcher's and Reagan's approach was to say that even the public sector had to be treated as a business enterprise. So that although it's the government that pays, it should still be accountable to market forces, therefore parents and the public. So you might say, how does it affect schools? Well, as leaders, it affects you enormously, because what we've done is we've made schools basically accountable to the general public, and that's been done through things like standardized testing, and the results of this standardized testing being publicly available. More and more importance being paid to the notion of parent choice. So that parent choice can have different meanings depending on jurisdiction in which you are. Almost all global North countries now believe in parent choice, but to different degrees. Obviously, most countries accept the fact that parents often vote with their feet or with their wallet. Therefore, they will buy a house in a catchment where the schools are doing better. So that's the first way in which parent choice influences schools and districts. The second one is that in some countries, like in the US, you have charter schools, so you have the options of taking your child out of the public system and your tax money following your child into a non-profit or a charter or a private but of public interest. And the third solution that's been adopted, for example, in Sweden or in Chile, is the notion of voucher. So in those cases, you literally pay your taxes. Your kid could go to public school, but you decided that your kid doesn't, and then you get given a voucher, and then you have free choice as to where you actually send that kid. And it may still be in the public sector, but it'll be a school of your choice, regardless of catchment, regardless of where you live, regardless of how much transport is required. So those are all examples of how we've given, added transparency, accountability, and this notion of competitiveness and client choice, which now becomes parent choice. So this has a huge impact on leaders, even leaders within the public sector, and sometimes they don't even realize, but they're still subject to that. So it's create hyper transparency in the sense that absolutely everything that you do and all decisions that you do are open to public scrutiny. Hyper accountability, mostly through standardized testing, and we'll discuss what standardized testing stands for. But really, it's the leaders that it's supposed to be actually assessing, not the teachers, not the kids. It's actually the leadership that it's supposed to be, getting a snapshot of, to allow then parents and school boards and the public to determine who's productive and who's not. Hypervisibility, in a sense that, as you know now, if we are to be competitors in a market, then suddenly we become subject to branding. And branding has become a very big thing now, even in the public sector, and we shouldn't calm ourselves. So a lot of things that we discuss and that you will discuss in your course 560, for example, in technology and other courses, are really, when we are explicit with language, what we're seeing is principles using leaders using technology, for example, for branding. So yes, it's great to have a school Facebook account. Yes, it's great to have a school Twitter account. Yes, it's great to do all of this sort of blog websites. But it's not just for great communication and you're going to have a course on communication. It goes beyond that. It's also for branding. Because in this climate of hyper-competitiveness, you have to position yourself as a strong school, an efficient school. And that's where the branding comes on. Is competition. There's definitely competition. And some of you may, if you've never thought about it from a sociological point of view, say, well, we're in the public sector, there's no competition. There is, because the penalty is risk of failure and risk of closure. So whether you look at England, you look at the States, you look at Canada, out of this branding, out of this competition, out of this hyper accountability, there is a penalty. And the penalty is that the schools that don't do well often are the ones that are closing. Demographics means that schools are closing anywhere in the global north, generally at a slow rate. But it's the schools that are doing the worst that will be closed first, and often then the students are transferred to schools that are deemed to be doing better. In the UK, for example, through Ofsted, it's a system not just of standardized testing, but of systematic school visits, a rating. And once a school is seen as being at risk, it's given a warning, it's given a time to change its approach, and if it doesn't succeed, then it is closed. In countries like Canada, it's more subtle, but it's exactly the same. So when I left Charlottetown, for example, Charlottetown closed down 3 schools, and it was very clear that this sort of accountability assessment of past productivity was done, and that it's the schools that do less well that are closed, and the ones that have been successful in this landscape, in this climate, that stay open. So you see that we are very much in a free market sort of situation. Even if you're not paying, you are very much considered to be paying by your tax contribution, and that you do have a lot of choice as parents, and that as business, schools have to be accountable, and when they don't produce, they do badly and eventually close. So what was the purpose of standardized testing? So we forget about this, especially as teachers, because we are already so stuck in it and getting mixed messages that it's easy to sort of forget what it was. But it was never meant for performance assessment, and it's really hard to get teachers to understand that. It's never, ever, ever meant to be for individual performance assessment, although I know that the reality is that it's become that. It's not even really meant for teacher productivity assessment or quality assessment or promotion assessment internally. It wasn't meant for that either. It was really to test leadership, to really compare schools in the big picture, meaning school to school and seeing who's doing what and who's doing it well, again, so that parents would have choices. It has sort of dribbled down, it has become something completely different, but that is really the essence of what standardized testing. It's a frequent but occasional snapshot of school performance, and it was meant then for leaders to take that on board and change leadership practices when they had to. It's not what has become, and that responsibility has been have been dribbled back. So I've got a cartoon on the next slide which shows you what it's become, but really it's the leader at the very top that was supposed to take accountability and react to it and make choices really without involving pressure on teachers or the head teacher or the teacher or the students. But as we see from that cartoon, has created huge problems because we've just dribbled down that accountability down to the students. Often I have a conversation with teachers when they are uncomfortable with this notion of accountability, in a sense that we are strange. We've not had accountability for very long and we're very uncomfortable with it. But we've got to remember the accountability is present in industry, in every trade, in every job, in every profession. And I like to make a comparison, for example, to someone who works in hospitality. For example, if you're a waiter or you work in hospitality or in hotels, you will have targets. You will be accountable. You will be assessed probably by your supervisor at the end of a shift or end of week to tell you whether you've been productive enough and you've met your targets. Now, the waiter who's not met targets doesn't run to the table and say, finish your meal now because I need that table and I need to get as many covers as I can tonight so I meet my target. You're still pleasant. You're still friendly. You still focus on service. But you keep in the back of mind that you have to also be efficient. And I would argue that as teachers, we've lost the plot a little bit and we sort of dribbled down this pressure onto the customer, which is really the kid, not just the parent. And so transfer our anxiety about accountability onto them, whereas really we should be taking the same approach that anyone in industry in client service is taking, which is to actually say, I'm going to be still focusing on creating optimal pedagogical experiences while knowing that I'm accountable in doing that. That's not what's happening. And I put that down to sort of how junior we are in this field, and that as institutions and often even as principals, we've not been used to the notion of accountability for long, and that we're still sort of toying with how to do it well. But really it comes down to principals not sort of fully taking on this responsibility of just being given feedback on productivity and then being subtly able to address that and to reach better results and better outcomes for their community and their organization. So this is what I mean by this, like finding a working balance within the neoliberal landscape. Some people, I think what you're going to find in literature and you're going to find also in audiovisual resources is that some people are doing that very well. They've sort of, caught on to the notion that that's all it is. Standardized testing is to tell you whether your institution as a whole is doing competitively okay in comparison with others. That doesn't mean that you have to change your pedagogical position. That doesn't mean that you have to divert off the course of away from what you've decided to be the values and the standards. And you saw it in that film. Why most likely to succeed? They get on, they do what they have to do. It works out. They still get 10% above the average national average of standardized testing. They don't go off course in terms of pedagogy just because they are accountable. And that's this balance that we have to find. And it's not unheard of. We're seeing now more and more schools which are finding a way of doing this compromise. Neoliberalism is never going to go away. We pretty much understand now that it's anchored. It was very successful as a campaign, and the public is generally satisfied with it, even if kids are not and the teachers are not. So it's not a matter of saying, hoping for the day when there will be no neoliberal landscape around it. I think it's there to stay. We have to work and live in that environment. So as educators and as leaders, we have to find a way to make it work. We have to find a way to stick to our pedagogical guns while understanding that we are accountable in a wider landscape that is very much sort of free market based. And that's going to be a challenge for us as leaders. So the last thing, this will finish for today, and then we can carry on Wednesday from where I left off. So it's worth having done this little bit of sort of flipped classroom. What I was going to ask you in class is examine the literature on leadership and pertinent models. We've seen what we need to address, and you can go back to the 5 points we had above, the list of challenges that we've seen for constructivist approaches, social constructivist approaches, exponential approaches, critical pedagogy approaches, and inclusive approaches. A thick sort of list of challenges that we are faced with as leaders. So now we have to explore the typology of leadership that I've offered you. There are the typologies. I've offered you one that you will keep coming across in different sort of literature and journal articles. And it's one that gives you an overall category. I'm not that sort of interested in this course in going down to, the nitty-gritty of each of those. I'd like you to have a big picture understanding of what are some of the choices that leadership theory offer us. And as I've explained in class, these are the general sort of 4 that you're going to keep coming across. So for Thursday, in your presentation, start maybe exploring some of these. I think you've explored some of them in 501, but you may need to revisit some of those. We've seen that trait theory is old and dated and doesn't really sort of represent the contemporary notion that we have of leadership being something we work towards rather than being something we're just born with. So I think that's fairly easy to deal with. The behavioral theories are less used these days, although, as I said, they were very popular in the 80s. But democratic remains very popular. Laissez-faire you may have to have a look at, although laissez-faire is divisive because some people construct it as something positive, others construe it as something negative. It's the assertion that you let people do what they want. It's not terribly popular in education and schools. It's very, very popular, obviously, if you run, for example, a firm. So imagine you're a firm of liberal profession, firm of lawyers, firm of accountant, where people have very similar power and sort of career. Then it's more of a partnership, and laissez-faire can work well. You may still have a leader, but that leader doesn't really have an executive sort of job. You're really just herding people that are very similar in profile and have similar authority. Works really well in creative enterprise. People who work in artistic talent, in TV and things like this. A lot of laissez-faire. If people are very creative, you don't want to stop that creativity, and you've got to let them get on with what they have to do. So sometimes leadership is very hands-off and lets people just get on with their creative endeavor, but not so popular in schools. And you understand why, obviously, because we do have a structure that's a lot more hierarchical than these companies. But out of all these 4, Southern Democratic you need to probably revisit, because it is still something that gets mentioned in the literature and something that we can see the benefits of. And certainly there's things you've said today that echo democratic leadership. Contingency theories, some of them get very detailed. They're often very elaborate. It's all authors that have worked a really different way of looking at leadership. But what they have in common, as I said, is a triangular situation where they always look at the context or the task. So it's not just this conceptual, sort of ethereal sort of attitude that the leader has, and that impacts the follower or the staff. But really, it's a matter of actually getting that stuff through a process to an objective that takes into account context. If you're going to explore one of the 4 contingency theories I've listed here, and there are many others, path goal is probably the one that you're going to find the most interesting. And I think some of what you've discussed today in terms, for example, of people who are considering, for our colleagues that are working overseas, considering government positions, a regulatory body influencing your work, targets being imposed by someone else, and to some extent in Canada, all of us, in terms of working within a neoliberal environment, with standardized testing, with pressure from an environment that's not just about pedagogy. It might be interesting to look at path goal theory. I'm not going to give you literature on this because there's ample amount of websites and wiki page and business. Don't be afraid to go into the business sort of field and see the sort of websites that are out there, and I will talk to you about path goal, and then you can export this back to our school context. But obviously the ones that are going to be the most interesting for us are going to be the power and influence theories. What they have in common is that they consider the influence that a leader has and how a leader creates that influence. A lot of them go back to the notion of motivation, particularly contrasting intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation. We've discussed this in pre-residency, so I'm not going to spend too much time, but Decky and Ryan are two authors that you need to look at if you're interested in the distinction. And obviously servant leadership, very similar to laissez-faire in a sense of servant leadership, saying really it's people get on with their role. Servant leadership not terribly popular in K-12, maybe more popular in higher education, but often a disaster because we are in the end very hierarchical institutions. So you do have a lot of leaders in higher ed who say I'm a servant leader, and what really they end up doing is nothing, and then there's great chaos that ensues. But it's a similar problem as really laissez-faire. Not sure it's great for us as leaders, but transactional leadership and transformation leadership are going to come up all the time. The influence here in transactional is about extrinsic motivation, rewards and punishment. It's very behavioral. In transformational leadership, it taps into intrinsic motivation. So for us, it's going to be very interesting because it's inspirational, big picture, and trying to get towards goals which inspire people. Now, all of the goals we've seen, constructivism, social constructivism, critical pedagogy, inclusion, and experiential learning, are going to inspire people. You're going to have people already very eager to reach these pedagogical goals. So transformational leadership is going to be quite interesting in the sense that it's going to tap into that rather than necessarily try and concretely encourage people to do certain things. It's going to go straight in tapping into these desires that we have for self-realization. And often as teachers, we want to do, for example, self-constructivism, as you've explained in the class, because it seems like fun, it seems like what we want to do, and we know it works, and we know it leads to right outcomes for students. These four sort of categories of leadership theory we'll come back to on Wednesday. So that slide I'm going to keep using. At the moment, you're just now starting an exploration as to, in view of the five sort of challenges and goals that we have in terms of pedagogy, in light of this neoliberal context that we are in. What are the leadership approaches that you are feeling more confident in enabling you to reach the outcomes that we've seen in the film, for example, the outcomes that are desired? So very much what I'm asking you again is, like, in that film, what leadership style, leadership approach do you think was at play behind the stage? We can only guess because it's not evidenced in the film, but what is the guess that we're making? And it will require that you do maybe a little dive into a little bit of the literature to be able to justify that in your presentation, but you've got a couple of days to do that. Tomorrow we're not touching on this. Tomorrow we're going to touch on collaboration. So that my talk fits with Trish's work that she'll do on cohort. And collaboration is important too, because as we've seen, and you put on board right away when we started looking at the debrief for the film, these teachers were working collaboratively. So for us as leaders, how do we create that? How do we, again, use leadership approach, leadership theory to make sure that that we create that rich, constructive, and sometimes difficult collaborative work? And that's what we'll touch on tomorrow. And on Wednesday, we'll come back to this, but we'll see how it links in with your values, with your own personality, and how, for example, if you choose transformational leadership, how do you get there if you don't feel that currently your experience or your temperament is in line with transformational leadership? How can we reconcile who we are and what you've seen in Unit 1 and how you've identified yourself as a leader, as an individual, and as a learner, as an individual, yes, and as a learner, yes. And then how do you reconcile that with your aims and your goals and your ambition in terms of leadership approach, and what work needs to be done on yourself? So that's what we'll look on Wednesday, and it will be a good occasion to go through all this again if there's anything that needs to be gone through again. So I hope this helps you, and I hope you have time to watch it tonight. The aim again is to give you as much to work with, so that on Thursday you're not in a rush to get all information together. Okay, so have a good night. I will see you tomorrow. I'm not coming in tomorrow morning because there's no community activity, but I will see you at lunchtime.